Hey there, Film Buds. Welcome back to the Film Buds podcast. I'm your host, Paul.
And I'm Lauren.
And we're joined today by a first-time guest of the show. I've known him for about, I guess, 10-ish years. Zach Laws. He is a former film journalist. He's a filmmaker. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you again after so long. And nice to meet you, Lauren.
Yes, nice to meet you as well.
Thank you.
For a little background on Zach, all three of us went to the same high school. He graduated in 2008. We
I'm
graduated.
An old man.
We graduated 2011. And then he went and got his degree at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. And that's where he and I actually spent most of our time together. I ended up doing a summer program.
That's right. Yeah, that's how we got to really know each other, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually still have you gave out awards to all of us.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about
And I still have mine, I think, somewhere around here.
Yeah.
I think it's in relation to me being sarcastic.
Yeah.
Sound like you and all.
Yeah.
But Zach's a very knowledgeable guy, and he has quite a breadth of information, especially about Oscar winners. I know that once upon a time you could ask him a year and he could tell you the best picture winner. Can you still?
Yeah, I can still do that. Yeah.
Oh, so, wow. Okay.
Yeah, haven't lost that. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
1954.
Oh, 1954. That was the year that, and I'm going by movie year, not the year of the ceremony. Okay, so that was the year that On the Waterfront won, and the other nominees were The Kane Mutiny, The Country Girl, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, and Three Coins in a Fountain.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's my parlor
great.
trick. So.
Well, when we put together this episode, one of my first thoughts was like, I wanted to get you on this year. You were on, like, I made a list of guests that I wanted to get in the show this year, and you were on it. And when we decided to do an Oscar year, I was like, Zach's going to be perfect.
Thank you.
So today, last week we did the 40s and the 50s. This week we're doing the 60s and the 70s. A little bit tighter gap than any of our other decades that we've done.
Mm-hmm.
It's only a 3-year gap from 67 to 70, with In the Heat of the Night and Patton. Very interesting films. I think that they both kind of sum up some of the attitudes and cultural sentiment going on at the time. Because the 60s and the 70s saw definitely a real transitionary period in terms of filmmaking that was largely reactionary to the cultural shifts that were happening at the time. And so throughout the 60s, you had women's liberation, or, second wave feminism. You had the civil rights movement. You had the beginning of the anti-war movement in the late 60s. And you saw a lot of that start to get represented in the films of that time. And so it seemed like a good way to sort of, touch on some of those touchstones. And also, since it's February and Black History Month, In the Heat of the Night also seemed like a great pick. Zach, do you have any background that you would like to share on the time period or the Academy at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's interesting about these two movies being paired up together is that, as you said, there was a transitionary period for Hollywood from the old Hollywood studio system of the golden age, which had been beginning to crumble under the weight of many different factors, productions kind of going over budget, not making their money back, audience tastes changing and looking for something a little bit more reflective of the times that they were in, just the realities of people getting older and dying, and what's fascinating is that there was still this struggle within the Academy between these kinds of newer visions that were coming out from people, like Arthur Penn with Bonnie and Clyde, and Mike Nichols with The Graduate in '67, the year that In the Heat of the Night won, or with Robert Altman's MASH, Bob Rafelson's Five Easy Pieces, the year that Patton won. And also the resistance to change by many of the people who still very much were a part of the old Hollywood establishment. So you can see in those same years movies like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and Dr. Dolittle nominated in '67, as well as things like Airport or Love Story, which I guess was sort of a new Hollywood thing, but very much an old Hollywood kind of a love story, just featured younger people in it. So you can see those kinds of fights playing out within the Academy Awards, which are always representative of what's going on in Hollywood at the time. And what's fascinating about these two movies that won is that they are both very much in the old Hollywood vein, but with new Hollywood attitudes in terms of how they deal with their subject matter. So in a way, you can look at them as being sort of like compromise choices, which is generally what the Academy goes for by and large. It's sort of like the movie that appeals to the most people at that specific time. The quote-unquote safe choice. And so I think that that's what's really interesting, is that you can kind of see on a micro level the struggles of old and new Hollywood playing out in both these Oscar years, and then also the movies that ended up winning Best Picture.
No, yeah, that's wonderfully well put. Thank you. That was a great little breakdown.
Oh.
If the Academy typically goes with a safe choice, just out of curiosity, what do you think this year's Best Picture winner will be?
I mean, if it's the safe choice, I would say it would be Belfast, but I think that it, all signs are sort of pointing towards Power of the Dog winning, just because of how much supported. The important thing to remember about the Oscars these years is that they've gone back to a preferential ballot when they expanded their Best Picture lineup. Back in the day of these films, throughout the entirety of their history of having 5 Best Picture nominees, they just did a straight number 1 vote, right? Prior to that, when they had more than 5, or more than 10 at some years Best Picture nominees, in the 30s throughout the early 40s, they did the preferential ballot, which basically means in order to win with number 1 votes, you have to get 50% plus 1 of number 1 votes. If no film gets that, then it goes into a second round of voting where they start going, it's a little convoluted to explain, but I'll try the best I can. Whatever film got the least amount of number 1 votes is eliminated, and then the number 2 film on that ballot gets a number 1 vote. And so they keep doing that until one film gets enough number 1 votes to win. So preferential balloting, you can kind of see films like Green Book, for instance, or films as varied as Green Book and Moonlight, I think, have won on preferential ballots. Films that have won on straight number 1 votes, I think, are more like your Parasites and Nomadlands, right? Sort of the odder Best Picture choices, you could say. I think that like Power of the Dog probably has the most support throughout the Academy membership, just based on the number of nominations that it got, and that could very easily win on a straight number 1 ballot. But if I'm picking like what could win most likely on a preferential ballot, that would be Belfast.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. No, that was all wonderful. I guess we can go ahead and jump into our discussion. I mean, that was very well put, and I honestly am not sure who's going to win. I know that a lot of people that I follow on Twitter are petrified of a Don't Look Up win.
Well, I mean, that could be one of those preferential ballot things. I mean, Yeah, again, it depends on like what movie. You have to think about it this way, all right? If something on a preferential ballot's going to win, it has to be a movie that isn't just a number one; it's a number two and a number three. And something like Don't Look Up is incredibly divisive, so that could be a number one or a number 10, right? Depending on how these things are ranked. So, I mean, I wouldn't be too worried about something like that, or things like, for instance, Drive My Car, which is a wonderful movie, but, a lot of people probably aren't going to watch because of its runtime and, it's in a foreign language. So they might say, I don't, I'm just not ranking it on my ballot, which is a shame because, your job as an Academy member is to watch movies,
Yeah.
But anyway, I think that, you want to find that movie that has like the broadest kind of support, that kind of like audience favorite type of thing, which Belfast has won lots of audience prizes throughout festivals, which kind of, it gives it's more of a formidable challenger to Power of the Dog than I think people might be giving it credit for.
Interesting. I haven't gotten to see Belfast yet. There are still a few of the Best Picture noms that I need to try and see. I'm not sure if I'll tune into the telecast, but I'm always still, even in the years that I don't tune into the telecast, it's always something that I still follow pretty thoroughly. So there are definitely a few that I still need to get caught up on. But I am all caught up on some old ones, and so. Without any further ado, we'll go ahead and jump into In the Heat of the Night, and we have a little clip for y'all, so give it a listen.
On your feet, boy. I mean now.
Got a name, boy?
Virgil Tips.
Virgil. Where you come from?
There ain't no trains this time of morning.
I could have had you shot. Skulls caved in.
Could have been a hitchhiker.
Okay. So that was In the Heat of the Night. It came out in 1967. It was directed by Norman Jewison, and it stars Sidney Poitier, Rod Steiger, who was in one of the movies last week. He was in On the Waterfront. Warren Oates, Lee Grant, Larry Gates, James Patterson, and I had to throw him out even though he's a minor character also, the one, the only Herschel, Scott Wilson. And so the premise is a Black Philadelphia police detective is mistakenly suspected of a local murder while passing through a racially hostile Mississippi town, and after being cleared is reluctantly asked by the police chief to investigate the case. Zach, since you're our guest, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this movie several times, and I think that it might not have the same kind of electrical charge that it had when it first came out and was so revolutionary in the way that it presented race relations in America at that time. But I think that it still functions as a terrific mystery thriller. And it is, when you look at the ways that other films of that time dealt with race, it does hold up a lot better, I think, in terms of how it goes about dealing with those issues. And that's in large part to the way that it handles the Sidney Poitier character. And, to put it in the context of the time, at that moment, Poitier was the only black actor, the only black male actor to have won an Academy Award. Hattie McDaniel had won for Gone with the Wind prior to that. And he was the most prominent black actor in Hollywood. He was largely playing roles that were sort of sexually neutered, kind of docile, very much a kind of like helpful, sweet-natured, non-threatening individual that made him very palatable to white audiences at the time of the civil rights movement. And in this movie, I was paying a lot of attention to his performance this go round. And I think what this film does that films like, say, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner from the same year failed to achieve is find what's going on underneath his constantly having to present himself a certain way in front of people. There's this simmering rage underneath a lot of his scenes that you can just see that's about to come out. And it comes out most famously in that scene where he slaps a white man, which, even still, I think is really powerful to watch. Because it was the first time he'd seen anything like that in a movie, and he was not immediately reprimanded, killed, what have you. And I think that the way that the film deals with those aspects could go very wrong. And in a lot of ways, they go wrong today. We see in recent movies the way that they deal with subjects of race. And a lot of the times it can be from the perspective of the white character. This movie could have very easily been about like how Rod Steiger's character learns not to be a racist, which, that element is there, but it's not the point of the movie. The point of the movie is Poitier asserting himself as Virgil Tibbs, coming into this town, solving this crime, in spite of all of these obstacles and preconceptions that are hurled at him constantly because of the color of his skin.
No, absolutely. So I hadn't seen this one. Had you seen this one, dear?
Yeah.
Okay. I hadn't seen In the Heat of the Night. Lauren and I talked about it a little bit before and after, and it was one of those movies that growing up as like a movie kid, if you watched any of the AFI specials or stuff like that, great movie quotes, the 101 best movies or what have you, it was one that I grew up seeing a lot. The "They Call Me Mr. Tibbs" line was a clip that was regularly shown. And so I knew a little bit about it. And obviously I knew some of Sidney Poitier's work. The most recently we had seen him in Blackboard Jungle from the 50s. And I think that this movie, to your point, does really a very deft job at handling the racism of the time, and it's omnipresent, but it's not sort of cranked to 11 to try and hammer home the point. It's living in that sort of, he just sees a black guy at a train station and just picks him up, and it's very earnest and very straightforward. And I think that if you have, like a history and knowledge of the time, it does still have a lot of that impact. I think Rod Steiger does a great job, having seen him, from a film 13 years before where he was kind of like a minor character. Seeing his performance here, I thought that he did a tremendous job. And I think you're right. I think that Sidney Poitier's character does have this, Mr. Tibbs has this underlying anger, and you constantly see it, this kind of fighting back and this kind of tenseness, this clenching that is so regularly painted on his face. You can just see it so clearly. And I was doing a little bit of research before the episode, and he was insistent upon slapping Endicott back. He got the script, and he was talking with the director and the producer in his apartment, and he was like, no part of me, as whether, it's a policeman or not, no part of me, thinks that I would just sit there and take it. And I'm insistent on it not just being put into the script, but being put into the final film. And I think that he was pretty spot on. And I think that, you know, because he was speaking with authority on the subject, you know, I think that they were willing and open to including his ideas on how to improve some of the racial dynamics of the movie. And I think that's one of the things that works best in it. Dear, what did you think?
I loved this movie. The performances are fantastic across the board. Everybody's very naturalized. It feels like, you know, it feels like a real place instead of a caricature of what, you know, this could look like in a dramatic version of the South. No, this feels like an everyday place. These feel like real people, which is always very important. And I agree. I think that let me get more stable for my thoughts. I think that Sidney Poitier is just he steals the entire movie for me. I think that this movie even resonates not only for the time that it came out, but also for the times that we live in today, you know, with a lot of racial injustice happening and a lot of racism across the nation and honestly across the world. It is still very, very powerful movie and a very powerful message. And honestly, I'd watch this movie again. I loved the fact that he slapped him back without hesitation. Because, you know, how would you feel about being slapped in the face by some man who thinks that he is better than you just because of the color of his skin? And the moment after when he starts to cry is perfect, because, you know, he's never felt that feeling before of being, you know, somebody's lesser. You know, he's never been struck before, probably in his entire life. And so, you know, getting dished back the treatment that he was giving is such a perfect moment. And like, I think that this journey of these people realizing that there's nothing wrong with Sidney Poitier, with Mr. Tibbs, and they all kind of have this parallel of this internalized anger, whereas our white characters, our sheriff can wear his anger on his sleeve. Sidney had to, you know, dampen himself down and correct himself on a regular basis because of his place in society. And I think that that's a really interesting dynamic to watch these two men who are very similar, but on different sides of the argument, of the issue. I really enjoyed this movie a lot. I thought that it was very, very powerful.
It is very striking to see a movie like this and compare it to some of the other movies that Poitier was starring in at the time, where, you know, things like A Patch of Blue, for instance, which I don't know if you guys have seen A Patch of Blue or not, but it's basically Poitier plays this man who begins a very chaste relationship with a young white woman who is blind, so she can't see that he's black, and the whole point of the movie is like, oh, you know, we are all the same if only we can like not see each other, right? He is constantly having these kinds of racial bigotries hurled at him in a movie like that, and his response is always having to remain dignified and take the high road and things like that, and never fight back. And so that was his screen persona for a long time, was always just like, you know, one of the good ones, right, as they would say at the time. Someone who can remain dignified and noble in the face of racial injustice. And what you see in this movie is the response to that so many people wanted to have, which was to fight back, right? And it is hard to, you know, seeing that scene today, you know, it's hard to really put into words what kind of impact that had for movie audiences at that time, because like you said, it was not in the original script because they never thought it would be possible to do. This movie was actually, you know, to further contextualize the time it was made, and they did not shoot it in the South, even though it takes place in Mississippi. They shot it in Illinois because Poitier said, if I go down below the Mason-Dixon line, there's a chance I could be killed, you know? And actually, there's a certain scene when they're outside, you can like see the cold breath coming out of their mouths. It was like wintertime when they shot this movie. It's supposed to be set during the summer in Mississippi. some of the sweat was probably chills from how cold it was. But yeah, I mean, this was at a time when movies with Sidney Poitier were not played in the South because the theaters would not book them. So this, I think that for some people to watch this movie today, that it might be hard to understand the impact that it had when it came out. But this really did help broaden the image that and the kinds of roles that Black actors could play in movies, which then paves the way for blaxploitation films like Sweet Sweetback, or Pam Grier movies. Shaft is another one. So yeah, I mean, this movie really does pave the way for the broadening of that image.
Mm-hmm. Well, and speaking on that, I was watching a discussion with Lee Carter, Norman Jewison, and the producer, who I am totally blanking on.
Walter
right
Marsh?
Yes. And Quincy Jones was brought in to do the music, and he was like, oh, I could get Ray Charles to sing the lyrics for the main song. And they contacted Ray Charles, and he was like, I want to see the movie. I want to know what the movie's like, because he didn't want to lend his vocals to something that he thought was going to be, just another movie or something that was not going to sort of represent Black people in a way that he found worthwhile. And the thing that ended up selling him was the slap. He was sitting there and he was listening to it intently, and he heard the one slap and then he heard the other. And he was like, did he hit him back? And he was like, yeah. And that was the thing that sold him on agreeing to make the movie and add his vocals to it. So I think, yeah, it's a fascinating movie, and if it had come out, or if they had tried to make it even just 4 years earlier, it probably wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, and it would have looked a lot different. I think there's one aspect of this movie that really should be talked about is its cinematography by Haskell Wexler, who's one of those people, along with Gordon Willis and Vilmos Zsigmond and Laszlo Kovacs, those guys who really helped shape the look of 70s cinema, this kind of gritty, more naturalistic style. The thing that Haskell Wexler really understood how to do better than any other cinematographer working at that time was light Black skin, because it requires a different kind of technique from what they would do with white actors. And part of the reason why cinematographers of before did not understand that was because they weren't really lighting a lot of Black faces, and certainly not in leading roles. And so that, just how Poitier is photographed in this movie makes a major difference in how his character comes across.
Yeah. No, and you can always, you can tell in certain situations, even in more modern movies, where someone, is not really sure how to light people of color. And it is a very particular thing, it's a whole subset. I was watching a roundtable, and they were, it was a group of Black actors, and it's not even just, the cinematography itself, it's hair, it's makeup, it's all kinds of stuff.
Oh yeah. Knowledge base is completely minimized because of the abundance of white focused stories, and just not a lot of Black actors being able to be stars and leads in movies.
And so yeah, you're absolutely right. This movie is also it's a groundbreaking movie on several levels, technically, narratively. It definitely, is a film that I think is rather deserving of the Best Picture moniker. Since it is a little bit of a mystery thriller, and it's worth talking about any aspect that we can, how effective did you find the mystery element of it?
Well, I mean, what I always find interesting, and I don't know how deep I want to go into spoiling this 50-year-old movie, is that it sets up that it's going to be this kind of grand conspiracy almost, but it turns out that it's a very simple answer to this question. I mean, this movie is not like Chinatown, where the murder has larger implications for the city and also for the lives of the people in it. This is really it's kind of one of those things where crime is just a random occurrence.
Yeah.
And I think that what I find really effective in the movie is watching Poitier put these pieces together, just by like little things that the other officers don't catch. And part of it is because like they're not used to dealing with things like this, right? I think the movie does a really good job of walking you through the paces of this mystery and keeping you guessing what it's going to be about until the end. And I appreciate the fact that it is just kind of like a small scale solution to this. It's a very human solution to it. Because oftentimes you can get kind of trapped up with, convoluted kinds of conspiracies and things like that. And so, I mean, I appreciate that aspect of it.
No, absolutely. The whole time that we were watching it, it does kind of almost feel like it's driving toward, to you, like you said, that sort of grand conspiracy, like something like Chinatown. But yeah, crime is so often just opportunity and motive, nothing really more than those two things. And so the reveal, of it at the end, and the simplicity of it is honestly kind of also a rare thing, I feel like, in a lot of the movies of the genre, especially when you get into like more modern mystery thrillers. It feels like very often it's some sort of big conspiratorial thing. And so yeah, I think that the fact that it does just kind of, it's a small town crime, sort of as simple as that.
Yeah, and they're so distracted by their own perceived notions for the crime, for Tibbs, for the whole thing. They're like, oh, it's just, I'm gonna keep just trying to tie it in a nice pretty bow, and this is obviously the answer because this is the evidence that was given to me the most recently, so therefore here it is. And constantly trying to push away at this man, even though he is smarter than they are, has more experience in this field, and is trying to help them in spite of themselves. I think that it's just really, I loved the ride the entire time of really trying to go down this rabbit hole of figuring out who was the actual killer and why, and the fact that it was just something so easy, because the movie constantly is going in this direction of it being something bigger, or just trying to brush it under the rug and make it easy, so that way we can go back on to life as we know it. Get rid of the riffraff.
Yeah, and I mean, Tibbs is not above those kinds of preconceived notions either, which I think is an interesting aspect of his character, and another way in which this movie changes Poitier's screen persona, which is that, in other films he always had to be exceptional, and in this film it's like, yes, he is the smartest person in the room, but he's not also above maybe trying to find the solution that fits his preconceived notions about Endicott, for instance, right? Like a part of him going after Endicott is, well, his assumptions about what crime is like in the big city, for one, but also the fact that he would just like to really take down this guy who was just so outwardly racist to him, when he went to meet him.
Yeah, and has like literal cotton fields and black people picking it, and it's a very, very powerful image as you drive into this man's property, and it feels like you've gone back 100 years, but here we are, in the 60s, with this man still treating black people like how they have been for so long. And it's just like, I mean, you know, speaking as a Black person, I would have probably tried to take him down too, because he just, you know,
Yeah.
he's just a horrible person.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you bring.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say that brings up another interesting point about the way that this movie deals with racism, because you know it's not. It deals with it both on a macro and a micro level. You know, it's like you see the kind of outward racism of somebody like Endicott, where he's like, you know, he's got Black people picking cotton in the fields as if they're still in the days of slavery. But, you know, also just little touches of the way that Poitier is constantly being called boy in the film, even though he's a fully grown adult, you know? And I think that like, the thing that this movie gets right is that, you know, racism is not just people in Klan hoods, or, you know, kind of like foghorn leghorn police officers. It's a lot of just like little microaggressions that get put out, sometimes even very innocently. You know, I think it's just like a part of the way that these people have been brought up to refer to Black people, right? And so it's just like ingrained in their thinking from that's the way it's always been, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the even in a small town, the systemic nature of it, you know. There's the Black side of town, there's the white side of town, and that's just how it is, you know. Certain people have jobs, certain people have other types of jobs, and that's just how it is.
No, yeah. And honestly, like, unfortunately, we haven't really gone too far away from that mindset. It's easier to stop it at the beginning, but the thing is, we never did that. We've been doing all of these little adjustments, and that's why we've allowed it to just continue. And so I think that's also why this movie was so profound, especially for myself, you know, even in this times that we're living in now. It's just because of the fact that, like, even, you know, in the 60s, we really haven't gone too far away from it. And it's just like a fascinating revelation.
Yeah. So Zach, if you had to give the movie a rating out of 5, what would you give it?
I'd go with 5 out of 5, honestly. I mean, you know, like I said, I think that it's easy to say, because the movie doesn't have the same kind of, you know, revelatory power that it had, just because we've seen so many films since then that have dealt with race. But I think that the movie still, I mean, you know, first off, it is a very effective just thriller on its own. It's really tightly constructed, edited by the great Hal Ashby, who would become one of the most important directors of the 70s himself. But there is also a real profundity to the way that it deals with race that I think still is effective today. Because it's not about, like, you know, the way that it deals with the Rod Steiger character too, I think is really important, because you never see him have this grand realization of, oh man, I'm a bigot, and Poitier actually is a good guy, and I should, you know, I should change my ways. There's just these little things that change with him from moment to moment, and that scene at the end where they shake hands, you know, they play it out in a wide shot as opposed to like doing close-ups on them or having music swell up. And I think that kind of subtlety is what makes this movie so effective, is that it's not trying to hammer home the point of, well, if we all could just shake hands and you know, be as one, the world would be a better place. It's like, no, these are little changes that are happening, and it's on a person-by-person basis. And you're not going to solve racism in one town just with, you know, one murder mystery. It takes a lot of these changes that are going to have to take place. So I think the movie is still very effective, and I would give it a high rating.
No, yeah, absolutely. Dear, what about you?
Oh, 5 out of 5. You know, on every level, I think that it's, you know, the script is great. I think that it's acted phenomenally. I think that it looks so good to watch it. I think just on every level, this movie is just is truly, you know, a work of art in its own right. And is completely deserving of Best Picture. I think that Sidney Poitier is a phenomenal actor, and I think that he takes this character to beyond what was written on the page, and really brings it to life. And I think that all of the characters are just real, and I think that that's something so rare, especially in like movies that we see today. I feel like everything is just kind of like this is the type, so therefore that's as far as we need to go. Everybody has their good things, everybody has their flaws.
No, absolutely. I'll go 5 out of 5 as well. It's tightly constructed. It's thematically rich. I think it has rewatchability. It's a very visually striking film. And yeah, I think that it's worthy of all the praise, and I definitely now understand, very much why growing up I did constantly see it referenced and brought up. And I think that it's really effective, even today. As a last little fun fact, I love a good fun fact. Lee Grant, who plays Mrs. Colbert, the wife of the dead man, had only started acting again about 3 or 4 years before this, because she had been a blacklisted actor going back to last week through HUAC. Her husband had been named and she refused to give testimony, and then her name came up in the publication The Red Channels, which I talked about last week as well. And her refusal to testify and her appearance in the Red Channels led to her being blacklisted. And she hadn't really had a lot of work in quite some time. And they came to her, and she knew that they were friends and that they were kind of giving her a little bit of a bone because she was getting back into the world of acting. But she had actually been nominated for one of her first acting performances, and then like a year or so later she was blacklisted and was out of the game for 12 years.
Wow. Well, honestly, looking at this performance, you would have never known that she was just like not working.
Yeah.
for over a decade.
Yeah, she was. She actually did eventually win an Oscar a few years later for Shampoo, that was directed by this film's editor, Hal Ashby. So
full circle.
Yeah.
And I guess without further ado, we'll now move into our 1970 Best Picture winner, Patton. And we've got a little clip, so take a listen.
This is Patton, a salute to a rebel, a man whom the New York Times described in an editorial 2 days after his death as a legend, spectacular, swaggering, pistol-packing, deeply religious and violently profane, a strange combination of fire and ice. George C. Scott as General Patton.
If they followed my plan, I'd be there by now. I'd cut off the retreat of every damn German and hang on this island. I didn't pick you.
Carl Malden as General Bradley.
I picked you. You're one of the best field commanders I've got, but you don't know when to shut up, George.
So that was Patton. It came out in 1970. It is directed by Franklin J. Schaffner, and it stars George C. Scott, Carl Malden, Carl Michael Vogler, Stephen Young, Michael Strong, and the premise is the World War II phase of the career of controversial American General George S. Patton. For a little bit of context, for those who don't know, and a little bit of just fun historical background, George Patton was a U.S. general in World War II. He came from a family of Southern military men. His father had been in the military and wanted to fight, but never got the chance to. His grandfather had been involved in the Civil War for the South. And as part of, the sort of downfall of the Confederacy, they ended up a little bit poor for a while, but got back on the come up. And he was apparently dyslexic, and his father really wanted him, since he never got to see war, he wanted him to get into war. And he studied very rigorously. He ended up going to military college. He was quite the athlete, but really primarily in solo sports. He didn't really do team sports very well. And he
makes
ended
him
up
a general.
And he ended up competing in like the 1918 Olympic Games in the pentathlon, which included 5 events of like swimming, long distance running, shooting, I think like wrestling, and I can't remember what the 5th event was, and he placed in 5th. He wanted to fight in World War I, finally got to the front lines, was there for 3 days, and then the war was over. And this movie was actually sort of started, they tried to get this movie off the ground in 52 to 53, because the head of the studio at the time and one of the producers had both served in World War II and had interacted with Patton. And they wanted to do a whole big movie on his entire life. And legend has it that they called the family to ask for the life rights. And it just so happened that it was the day that Patton's wife was being buried and had her funeral. And apparently the family was so disgusted by this that they dug their heels in and said, absolutely not. And so it got shelved for a while. Yeah, shocker, right?
I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And it got shelved for years, and then they finally got the rights to 2 books. General Bradley's The Life of a Soldier, and the Patton biography that was written. And then they put it together from there. And so that's a little bit of fun background for you. Zach, would you like to start us off on this one as well?
Yeah, I mean, talking about how long it took for this movie to get to the screen, one of the people who was hired to write the script for this movie was Francis Ford Coppola. This is back before he was the great director of Godfather and Apocalypse Now and The Conversation and all those movies. This is back when he was like struggling to get his foot in the door. And I think that a lot of credit for this film's success and its durability over the years has to go to him, because in many ways this is a very traditional kind of epic film that Hollywood had been making for decades before. This kind of like life of a great man in history told on a giant canvas. But the thing that Coppola talks about when he was writing this film was that, he did not particularly care for Patton politically, but he found out some things in his research about him that made him a fascinating figure to him, like the thing about how he believed he had been reincarnated from other great generals, or the fact that he wrote poetry, or the fact that he just like so badly wanted to be leading an army because he felt that it was God's intention for him. And those are the things in this movie that make it more fascinating than a lot of other kinds of films like it that were being made at the time, is that there's this kind of psychological complexity to, there's all these like stories about Patton about how he slapped a soldier, and how eccentric he was. But, trying to burrow underneath of, okay, like what were the reasons behind these actions that he took, right? Why did he want to go to battle so badly? Why did he slap that soldier? I think it makes it a much more interesting film than it could have been, while still at the same time being very traditional in a lot of ways. The director of this movie, Franklin Schaffner, he was a TV veteran. He was kind of a journeyman director throughout the 60s and 70s. He made the original Planet of the Apes movie. He made Papillon a few years after this. Really good at just kind of like studio entertainment that benefited from these kinds of new nuances and complexities that were being peppered in from old Hollywood. So in a lot of ways, this is a very traditional movie, but it's also very much of a product of the 70s.
No, absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned Planet of the Apes. That's actually the movie that made them decide to hire him.
Oh yeah.
Dear, what did you think of this? You had not seen Patton before.
No, I'd never even heard of Patton before before watching this movie. I'm a big history buff. I leave that to my father, who obsesses over the wars and could tell you all of the facts. So I never heard of this man before, and watching this movie, I found him fascinating. Honestly, I think that the portrayal of him is unlike anything else that I've really ever seen. He is unlike any other person that could possibly have a movie made about them. Honestly, truly a unique individual, and I really enjoyed watching this journey of his story through the war. But that opening scene is truly just absolutely iconic. I love the whole visual of it, you know, the huge American flag behind him, you know, feeling like you are one of the enlisted, and he is giving you this speech, and you're going to go off and you're going to kill some Nazis, and that's what's going to happen. And truly a passionate individual. I wouldn't necessarily have wanted to work with him, but I think that honestly, to each their own. I also don't want to go to war, so you know, we have to have people like him who desperately want to go to war to fight all these things that we need fought. But no, I think that this movie was absolutely just epic. I don't know what we would have done if it was his entire life story. I think that movie might have been like 5-6 hours long. We've already got almost 3 for just the war itself. But no, I just there's nobody like him, and I also just like the fact that this movie, unlike any other historical person movie, you know, especially of the times and early, they're usually very like heroic and, you know, unwilling to look at somebody's negative parts in order to tell this story to make everybody happy. Whereas like I felt like this movie really had a nice balance of showing him as he sees himself versus how others see him.
No, absolutely. So I watched like a documentary on Patton while doing some work today, and I think one of the reasons that it also does work so well is that they're pulling directly from him. Mm-hmm. So much of what his character says, what George C. Scott says throughout the movie, are direct quotes of his, you know, just peppered throughout, and having so much material to draw from. I think that Coppola was really able to, you know, get to the core of who this guy was, piece through this kind of weird portrait, you know, of his poetry and his speeches, and the, you know, fantastical stories around him, and patch together this very, very complex portrait. I had seen this movie like once long ago. I had watched Dr. Strangelove, and I had mentioned really enjoying it. And I think I had watched it with either my mom or my mom and my dad. But I was talking about it later, and I was talking about how funny, you know, the George C. Scott character is in that movie. And they were like, well, if you like George C. Scott, you know, you should really watch Patton. And and so, like, honestly, like 13 probably I was when I first saw Patton. And I really liked it then, but like it was just one of those movies that I hadn't circled back around to. And coming back after so long and having some sort of mental picture in my head of like what this movie was, you know, based off of what I remembered of it, and then sitting down and having that opening like 6-minute speech just completely blew me away. And I think the movie manages to, you know, it manages to not just be that 6 minutes. It manages really complex emotional journeys for a man that could easily be condensed down to a caricature of what that 6 minutes was for the rest of the movie. But his character has peaks and valleys that make him very complex. And it's especially fascinating because it was very much at like the peak of anti-war sentiment in Vietnam. And I think that what's interesting is apparently upon release, people who were kind of pro-Vietnam War thought that it was a great war movie that sort of justified their cause. And people who were anti-Vietnam thought that it kind of justified their opinion on the negativity of war and some of the people that take part in war, that have this kind of lust for battle.
Yeah.
And I think that it does really walk this very fine line that I don't think that there are a lot of biopics that dig as deep into a person to where they can walk such a fine line about what this person did or didn't stand for and what that impact meant. On top of that, it does also have just some absolutely fantastical battle sequences as well. You know, on top of it being a biopic, it is also still a war movie. And I would say that also the war stuff that we saw was right there on par with some of the war stuff that we saw in Wings.
Mm-hmm. You know, essentially, you keep talking about that opening and how great it is. That was actually the reason why Coppola got fired off of writing this film, was because they said, this is too weird. We don't like this. And so, I mean, it's a miracle that that stuff ended up surviving. He was eventually replaced. I don't know how many other people worked on the script, but the other credited writer who won the Oscar with him was a guy named Edmund H. North. I believe that was his name. I don't know exactly what his contribution was, but you know, we can guess maybe some of the more traditional elements of this film. But yeah, I mean, I think that what I appreciate about this movie is that there is an attempt, much like what David Lean does with Lawrence of Arabia, to kind of look beyond the myth of a person and understand what made them tick as a human. I would say that, you know, this movie doesn't reach the heights of something like Lawrence of Arabia because it's dealing in a more kind of literal way, right? A more kind of traditionally biographical way. Whereas like Lawrence of Arabia is more about metaphor and, you know, understanding man's place within the vastness of the desert and things like that. But this movie did, you know, set the template for what a lot of like really good biopics would be, which is to not necessarily focus on a person's entire life, but to focus on an aspect of their life that best encompasses who they were, right, in history. And so by focusing this on his World War II days, you're able to get a sense of what made this guy tick, right? His need to be a great man of history, right? His need to be in combat and to lead an army. And also the ways in which his own disproportionate sense of self often stood in the way of him achieving those goals, right?
No, absolutely. The movie definitely, to your point, does a good job of making him his own worst enemy regularly, routinely. And there are definitely a few liberties taken, but you are right. It is a very literal, very direct um, telling of his time in the war. One of the little side characters that I found the most interesting was the German aide that was doing all of the research on Patton. I found that character sort of very interesting, and on a certain level, he doesn't function as an audience character, but he kind of has this outsider perspective that a lot of audience members, I think especially now, have, where you're trying to figure out who this guy is, what he stands for, who he was before this. And so I think that character is a really, really interesting addition. It could have just been, Rommel and the other Nazis talking about what they were going to do. But by including this kind of research figure who goes in and explains some of the intricacies of Patton as a person that we were never going to learn, on the Patton side of the story, I think does a really good job of deepening audience understanding of the man.
When he stares at his headshot
before burning it, yeah.
Slowly into the fire. It was a perfect moment. Longingly was like, oh, but maybe if I just could keep this one,
I'm gonna commit this to memory.
Yeah, I mean, those scenes are interesting just because like so often in war movies, the enemy is seen as this kind of like homogenous, faceless kind of evil, right? And by having so many scenes set within like the Nazi headquarters, the Nazi army headquarters, it kind of like, I don't want to say humanizes Nazis necessarily, but it gives you a sense of like what Patton was up against, right? Mm-hmm. The ways in which they were, because like when this movie starts, the American army is getting its ass kicked, right? And Patton's like being brought in to, clean everything up, right? And, I think understanding like what they were up against in terms of the Nazi army's strategy and the amount of research that they were putting into their opponents and the amount of work that they were doing and planning these attacks, right? So it's very hard to kind of like make an audience feel like, are they going to make it out of this, right? But by having those scenes in the movie, it does a good job of contextualizing the fight that the kind of the strength of the opponent that they were up against. And that's another thing that kind of separates it from raw World War II epics of that time, where very often it's about like, American exceptionalism, and there's just no beating the American spirit, and we're going to kick their ass no matter what. It's like, no, the German army was formidable. And, that's why World War II was as, as bloody as it was.
Yeah. And it also creates a great mirror, off of them doing all of this sort of reconnaissance and research on him. And then you get that great moment where you see that he's reading Rommel's book on tank strategy,
Mm-hmm.
And so it creates this great mirror dynamic of him and his adversary, how they're both the same and different.
Mm-hmm.
There's also an interesting kind of thing of like where he's kind of ruefully looking at the German soldiers being killed, and it's like, oh, it's a shame, what a good army they have, right? Like there's this sort of like, weird mutual admiration for he's like his looking at the German army, and it's like the rigor with which they control their troops, like he kind of like almost admires them, right? Mm-hmm. It's like there's a formidable adversary for him. Yeah.
Well, I think that the same could be said about the German side of it as well when they're looking at Patton, that one scene about Normandy where they're like, oh, we got to follow him over here. They're definitely not sending out their best general, talking about him with such like praise, honestly. Like, oh, this is a good opponent for this war that we're fighting. It's very interesting.
it was a little bit reminiscent, going back to Wings, of some of the deference that the two, dogfight divisions had for each other, the Americans and the Germans, and how, when the Germans think that the one guy, or when the German pilot thinks that the one guy has been killed, he risks flying low over the American base to drop a note, to inform them, and that kind of thing. Or how they get into the dogfight and the gun jams, and so for one of the German pilots, it's no longer good sport. And so they agree to kind of, just sort of dissipate and go their own way. But I think that that's also sometimes, in the context of war, this kind of weird understanding of the difficulty that foot soldiers face, when across from each other.
No, I found this movie very interesting as a war movie in regards, honestly, to the balance, I would say, of the American side and the German side, because so often, not even just in war movies, but also in like fictitious versions of like World War II events, we are always fighting the evil of the Nazis, and they're like cartoonishly evil. Their portrayal in Indiana Jones is just hysterically like,
mustache twirling bad guys.
Yeah, and so it's it's very interesting to I guess, not to your point to say like humanize, but like to understand, that these are people, and they're not just like weird, fictitious versions of villains in our minds. These are people who get up every day and go to work and have jobs, and this is their job.
Yeah. It's a little bit of kind of like the Ed Kemper interviews in Mindhunter. Ed Kemper is still a monster. No one can ever say Ed Kemper is not a monster. But if you can go in and you can explain some of the monster, as a figure, and sort of demythify and demystify the whole thing, you get a clearer picture of what it was and who it was. I think that this is a really great movie, and also it saved Coppola's bacon on The Godfather.
Yes, so I mean, thank goodness for that. He won, both of those Oscars for those. So.
Go ahead.
I want to just point out, this is sort of like a historical thing about the context of which this movie came out. You can sort of see the internal battle between old and new Hollywood playing out at the studio this movie was produced at, 20th Century Fox, because it was one of 3 war films that they were producing at the same time. The other one was Tora Tora Tora, which was this kind of epic look at Pearl Harbor from both the American and the Japanese perspective. It was filmed on this large scale. It had 3 directors, excuse me. Akira Kurosawa was originally directing the Japanese segments. He was fired and replaced by 2 other filmmakers. Richard Fleischer handled the American segments. And, it's very much a kind of traditional war epic, right? Very kind of like hagiographic and patriotic, and huge, right? Kind of old Hollywood movies that were starting to go out of fashion at that time. And then the third one was Robert Altman's MASH, which was very much a new Hollywood kind of film, both in the ways that it was made with like all of these alienating devices of the muddy soundtrack, the zoom lenses, but also in the whole attitude of, the kind of like rambunctious, anarchic, there's bad language in the movie, there's nudity in the movie, and even though it's set during the Korean War, it's very much about Vietnam, and the scenes within the medical tents are very bloody and gross, which is just like war actually is, and it reflected a lot of the sentiments that people were feeling at the time. And so again, it's like you have Patton, which kind of straddles the line between being a very traditional kind of epic war film and at the same time having this psychological complexity that was becoming more and more prevalent with new Hollywood filmmakers.
No, absolutely. And you can even, I think, kind of see it in, you know, going back to the fact that there was a revision on the script. I think that you can kind of almost see it when you're looking at what I assume Coppola wrote, which is probably a lot of the exteriors where Patton waxes, you know, poetically amongst this ruin, you know, versus when I think it's more than likely our second writer who's doing this kind of by the book stuff, and it's in the set, and it's a very straightforward scene. And so it's sort of, I think, the clash of the ideologies, like you said, even playing out in the movie itself, of what the new writer brought versus what Coppola brought to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think that's well said. And I think, you know, again, like this movie, I think does a really good job overall of focusing on this man's internal struggle with himself, you know, and that I think helps it overcome some of the more like traditional Hollywood war epic type things that, you know, would kind of date it.
Yeah. Whenever he's on screen, it's magnetic. It's absolutely magnetic. If you had to rate it out of 5, what would you give it?
I'd probably go about a 4 out of 5 on this one. I mean, it's a movie that I've watched a lot, but it's not something that I've returned to many times. But every time I return to it, like if I have to record a podcast episode on it, I am impressed by a lot of it. You know, I think that there's the way that Franklin Schaffner directs this movie is also commendable in a lot of ways, because you know there are those very traditional kind of scenes in rooms where they're talking over battle, and you know it kind of feels like any other war movie. But he is like trying some new things, like with handheld cameras, and you know the way that he shoots the opening scene of the movie, or the way that he looks at the ruins of war, which I think are very forward looking in terms of what we would see in even more realistic and even more metaphorical kind of war films that would come after it. So I think it's a really spectacular movie, even in spite of some of the ways that it might have aged.
No, for sure. Dear, how about you?
I think I'm gonna go 4.5. I really enjoyed this movie. There were times, honestly, that I forgot that this movie was made in the 70s. It felt very, you know, very clean, very crisp. And then there were moments where I was like, oh, there it is, right here. This whole scene. This feels very much like an episode of Star Trek or something, you know, them in their war room and very clearly on a set, a lot of makeup, and you know, I was like, oh, these are rough moments right here. But honestly, overall, I thought this movie was very interesting to watch, very informative, and I really enjoyed getting to see a different side of World War II than the praised, I guess,
the flag waving.
Yeah, very outwardly patriotic versions of World War II. I really enjoyed just seeing a man as honestly as we could get him, and his effect on everyone around him. Just a true character, honestly.
Well, now I didn't realize I could do a half star, so I might bump it up a little bit just for that. I don't want it to sound like I didn't like the movie as much as you guys did, you know. So,
well, it's funny. I was honestly going to go 4. You know, it definitely does have some of those little dating markers and some of those slowdowns. But honestly, I think a 4 to 4.5 is wherever you would like to fall on it. I think it's honestly very fair. It's impactful, and I think that it's impressive that it still manages to be impactful.
I think that our lead is just phenomenal. I know that his name is also George, but I can't think of his last name at the
George
moment.
C. Scott.
Yes, I think that he's absolutely just amazing.
Who, you know, just speaking of the Oscars, not only refused his nomination, but refused his win when he did not like the Oscars at all. He thought that it was just a meat market, and he thought that it was wrong to pit actors against other actors. And he was nominated 3 times throughout his career and refused every single nomination, 4 times, excuse me, throughout his career, and refused every single nomination. And when he won for this prize, he did not show up. The film's producer accepted on his behalf and then gave the statuette back to the Academy the next day per his wishes. So,
fascinating. I saw a little vintage interview segment with him, and he, as preparation, said that he read, if I'm not mistaken, 14 books.
wow.
And said that he watched several thousand feet of footage regularly.
I mean, the work shows, honestly.
And there were several people who were brought onto the film as consultants who had served alongside Patton. They brought in Bradley. He was still alive at the time. And one of Bradley's primary aides as well. And they all said that when George C. Scott was walking around, it was Patton walking around. He had the demeanor, he had the character, you know, he locked in on who he was, which is also interesting because much like Coppola, George C. Scott did not much care for the man either.
You know, I was going to talk about that earlier, and the thought escaped me because, you know, conversation led in other directions. But I think that it is a test as a writer, as an actor, to really talk about something that you or perform as something that you completely just don't agree with.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think that that's how we got such an honest portrayal of who he was, because we weren't looking at his life through the rose-colored glasses of somebody else's like love for him.
If anything, you had to find your way into why you liked them.
Exactly, and I think that that's a more interesting journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's kind of that's a great gift of filmmaking, right? To kind of have you empathize and understand somebody who you don't think that you would normally like. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, because even if he's not somebody that like I agree with politically or agree with his methods, I'm fascinated by him, and I want to understand what it was that made him behave in that way and what drove him to do these kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, I think that's like, you don't have to always like the people that you're seeing or making movies about, but it is important to understand them and, you know, to try and understand them.
Mm-hmm.
No, absolutely. Because also it's all still a part of the human condition, you know, and of our own history. And you can find yourself mirrored, even if it's just a part of yourself, in someone that you don't like. And it's always worth exploring, you know, all of those little pockets and figuring out who we are, who you are. Again, like you said, whether it's someone that you like or someone that you don't like.
I mean, honestly, I think that the best villains are ones that you love to hate, you know, the ones that you understand completely where they're coming from, but like, you know, they went that step too far.
Yeah.
Right.
As a last little fun fact on the movie, and then we'll do our final few topics that I wanted to sort of talk about. The movie was shot in Spain.
Oh.
They needed locations that could fill in for multiple places. And so the place that they ended up deciding was Spain. And then on top of that, the Spanish army still had a whole plethora of US military gear that they had gotten during the war or sometime shortly thereafter. And so like a lot of the tanks and the trucks and the planes and stuff like that were stuff that the Spanish government had at the time and were willing to loan to the production. And actually the 2 German planes that you see prominently in the film were also in their possession. Either they had crashed or they had bought them or what have you. But it was all like World War II equipment that the Spanish government had and lent to the film.
Well, isn't that convenient?
Yeah.
So the last few bits that I wanted to talk about, the first thing was I had mentioned it very briefly, and I won't go too deep into the history of it. Was for your consideration campaigns and campaigning for Oscars, because there is a political nature to this whole thing, and there's a game played to it. Zach, do you want to? You were in the thick of it for a little while. Would you like to?
I sort of still am, I guess. It's
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think it's become more so in the last few decades. Sort of the influence of Harvey Weinstein, unfortunately, that kind of set the tone for making Oscar campaigning almost more important than the actual films itself, and that is just like back in the olden days, it was a lot of the extent to which there was talk about the Oscars. It was like newspapers would put out their predictions, and gossip rags like Hollywood Reporter, Variety would say, these are the movies that are sort of in the conversation, right? But there wasn't really this kind of like barrage of FYC stuff all the time. There were screenings and there were parties, and sometimes producers and studio heads would work certain branches of the Academy to get their movies nominations, and that's how you end up with films like Dr. Dolittle getting nominated for Best Picture, even though everyone knew that movie was not very good. They just they worked the craft branches of the Academy, where a lot of the kind of old-fashioned old Hollywood figures were still very much prevalent. But yeah, I mean, it's a whole thing. It's a little different now because of COVID, but certainly, I mean, I remember last year when everything was shut down, the complaint that I heard from a lot of anonymous Oscar voters were, we hate this. We really want things to go back to normal, meaning we want to be back to getting wined and dined at every event we can possibly go to. So,
I'm sure.
yeah.
So for a little historical context, back in 1930, Mary Pickford, this was the first time that anyone had kind of campaigned in any kind of serious way, invited over several people and essentially, gave this very, very lengthy discussion about why she should be nominated for Best Actress that year. And it ended up working. She did get nominated, and I believe that she won in 30. But the actual first time that anyone really started a full-on campaign, there were other instances where people like put out an advertisement. Louis B. Mayer went and took out an advertisement for a film that at the top lot of the advertisement apparently had a picture of Leo, the MGM lion, and it said, Leo, you give so much, it's time to receive. But then the first time that anyone really ran like a particularly serious big campaign was in 1945, where Joan Crawford hired a press agent to go and come up with like an entire strategy. So campaigning has been a part of it for a long time, but like Zach said, it really got ramped up, especially under Harvey Weinstein. There's a piece that you can go and read. It's a really fascinating read. I think it would make for an incredible movie, honestly, where he waged a war of absolute attrition, campaigning to get Shakespeare in Love not just nominated, but to beat Saving Private Ryan at the Oscars. And he had a whole bunch of old Hollywood guards who were retirees in Florida on the payroll to call up other people and old connections and things like that. And it's a really fascinating read if you haven't read it. And he gave them like a script and was like, tell them that the beach scene is the best part, but that it's just a war movie after that. And like he went all out in trying to bring that movie down, and he ended up winning.
Well, I mean, joke's on you, Harvey, because like, I've never seen Shakespeare in Love, but I've seen Saving Private Ryan.
Well, I mean, it is a pretty good movie. You should check it out, I would say. You probably shouldn't have. I think that not to give credit to this monster, but I think that the thing that he did understand, that a lot of people now understand because of the burgeoning independent film movement that was happening in the 80s, like the Oscars were the best way to get a lot of these movies noticed by people, And the reason why there is such an emphasis put on campaigning for Oscars in this day and age is because there is, to win an Oscar and to get nominated for an Oscar can mean a financial boom for your film. That's why a lot of these movies will get released at the end of the year, because if they're still in theaters when the Oscar nominations come out, and more importantly, when the Oscar wins happen, people are more incentivized to go see them. Like that's how a movie like Parasite ended up making as much money as it did at the box office, was because it had Best Picture heat, and it ended up winning Best Picture. And so people were like, I guess I got to go see this. Yeah. So, I mean, that was something that he understood, and that a lot of other people took upon themselves to adopt as well. They had no choice because he was such a ruthless individual, in more ways than one, we found out, that it was easy for your film to get lost in the sort of Miramax machine. And a lot of the people who worked on the Shakespeare in Love campaign are still doing it to this day. They're still like some of the top Oscar consultants who are working right now for a reason, because they like know how to pull off those unlikely victories.
Yeah, they know how to pull off an upset.
Yeah.
It's like politics, honestly.
Yeah, it is exactly like politics, except for movies,
Yeah. Yep.
Beyond that, there was the announcement this week, keeping everything sort of Oscar themed. They're doing a 3-host structure this year. And they announced that the 3 hosts are Regina Hall, Wanda Sykes, and Amy Schumer. Apparently everyone is going to get an hour block kind of to be the host. I don't know if they'll all open the show together, or if it's just going to be, one of them opening the show and then like a handoff. We'll see how it goes. They've been hostless 2 years now.
Yes, it was 2 years in a row. Maybe even, 2. It's hard to remember. It's hard to keep track of time these days.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. I don't know why they wait to the last minute to announce some of these things. I feel like, I mean, we'll see how these 3 hosts do. I'm sure they'll do fine. I just, I feel like if they're going to have somebody host it, then, they should be like hyping this up for a while, right?
Yeah.
Drive interest up for what people are going to see. I think they're kind of like hesitant to ask anybody, just because of it's been a while since anybody's hosted, and they're this kind of like fear of Twitter, I suppose. Even though like people who aren't on Twitter are gonna watch the Oscars too. Like I don't know. I wish they would kind of make these announcements a little bit sooner and start preparing this stuff a little bit sooner, so it can actually like feel like more of an event.
No, that's fair, because we knew who was going to be the halftime show act at the Super Bowl long ago. And so people who were interested in seeing Snoop and Dre and 50 Cent and Eminem had the opportunity to find out and tune in.
I think that the same, with the Tonys as another award show, I feel like we always have way more lead up of who the host is going to be, because also there's a lot of rehearsals and things that have to go into making this a whole event, where I'm curious to see how these 3 are going to play off of each other.
Yeah. It almost feels a little bit more like an SNL host announcement, where they're going to get like the script a week before, and
Yep.
Yeah.
And we're going to improv through all the mistakes.
Well, we'll see. I hope it's a good ceremony. Certainly, there's nowhere to go but up from last year's. Which, I mean, I understand there were some dire straits in that regard, so I don't want to give them too much grief about putting on a show under those circumstances. But nowhere to go but up, I suppose.
Yeah. And you mentioned Twitter. They also decided to throw Twitter a bone this year. There were two announcements about the Oscars this week.
Yeah.
The first was the host. The second is they're doing two categories. I'm not sure if they're going to get a statuette of any kind or just recognition.
Yeah.
But they're doing a Twitter poll for the sort of the people's movie, best picture kind of thing, and the best movie moment from the year. So like a singular scene or something like that. All I'm hearing is that they wanted to try and find a way to give No Way Home some recognition at the show.
Well, I mean, I hope it works out for them because, Twitter is filled with spam bots who can clog it up. I don't know. I feel like that's really silly. This whole thing about I feel like there's this sort of internal struggle because they're trying to recapture some of the ratings that they had back in the 90s when Titanic won. But, the ways that people watch television and consume media have changed so drastically that that's never going to happen. And also Titanic was like a once in a lifetime phenomenon, there's no recapturing that. And I think that, the thing about the Oscars has always been, not only are they a reflection of the time in which they are taking place, but there's always movies that are not going to get recognition for one reason or another, and the movies that do get nominated, it has to do with many different factors, just like what people liked at the time, which movie had the best campaign, all these different kinds of things. And so I think to say that the problem with the Oscars is that they're not listening to what audiences want enough. First of all, it's just not true, because if you look at the kinds of movies that have been winning Oscars and nominated for Oscars, there's a lot of things like, Joker or Black Panther or Bohemian Rhapsody or A Star Is Born. These are movies that made a ton of money, right? Avatar. There is no anti-audience, anti-box office bias at the Academy. It's just, they didn't nominate. I think that they didn't nominate Spider-Man for Best Picture because that movie doesn't mean anything to people who don't have an emotional connection to the other two films in that series. And so if Academy members haven't seen those other two films, they're going to go into this one and not get the emotional stakes of what it's doing, right? And so it's asking a lot of people to pick that as their favorite movie of the year if they don't feel any kind of investment in it, And it doesn't mean that the movie's not good or it's not enjoyable. It just means that it didn't speak to the Academy at this time. And that's just the way it goes. I mean, I was upset that movies like Pig and Red Rocket weren't nominated for any Oscars this year, but that's just the way it goes. So I say let them do it, and we'll see what happens.
No, absolutely. Well, we always like to include a little segment where we talk about what we're watching. So Zach, beyond the stuff that you watched for the show, what have you been watching?
Oh my God. I mean, I watch 10 movies a week, so it's very, I don't know. I rewatched RoboCop last night, which is great. So it's one of my favorite, another movie that did not get nominated for Best Picture, even though it probably should have. Yeah, I mean, I've been watching a lot of Paul Verhoeven movies lately. I like to focus on directors that I really like and go through their filmographies. Something that I like to kind of see how people's careers develop. You know, that's my thing. How about you guys?
Well, we have watched. We went and we did the Beatles rooftop concert IMAX presentation,
Nice.
which was really great. You know, you don't get the depth of like the full Get Back documentary, but getting to see it on such a huge screen with that sound was an incredible experience to see for a band that you literally, there's no way for you to see them perform anymore. And so that was pretty spectacular, especially as, you know, a Beatles fan. But I think even as like a more sort of secondary Beatles enjoyer, I think that yeah. I think that it has a lot of value, you know, as just a big event.
No, honestly, especially compared to, you know, going to concerts today, you know, it's such a whole to do where you're like, these guys are like wearing some crappy shoes, like whatever they wanted to put on for that day. They were like, oh,
two of them are in Converse, like actual Converse.
And so it's really like interesting to see, you know, the Beatles go and do a concert event where they're just kind of slumming it almost, you know, just kind of like wearing whatever. Just
Ringo looks miserable as shit in the cold on the dog.
Like what, January or something in England?
January 30, I think. Yeah.
On a rooftop, yeah.
Yeah.
They are miserable. But it's just a really just amazing experience, honestly, like to hear them as close to live as you possibly could.
Yeah, I really like concert documentaries like that are more about like the joy of performance than about acrobatics and pyrotechnics, which a lot of concerts have become. So
yeah. And then so this was kind of our Valentine's Day thing. So we did the Beatles rooftop concert too. And then I saw that we had screening near us Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I was like, awesome. You know, I've never seen Raiders on the big screen. She's never seen Raiders on the big screen. Let's do Raiders. And what I did not realize was that we had gotten tickets for the 40X experience, where it's like a theme park seat, but more uncomfortable. It's a little bit more like a torture device.
So you were like at sort of like the Disneyland ride of Raiders.
Yeah. Where they've got the smoke machine. Thankfully, I could turn off water being sprayed on me. There was a little button on my seat that allowed that. And they've got like the flashing lights, and it
was horrifying. One of the oldest rides at like Heroines or something, where you were like, I think I have a concussion after this.
Yeah.
We went out to have dinner after the movie, and we were sitting in like legitimate wooden seats, and they were more comfortable to sit in.
I've never seen a movie in that format, so it doesn't sound very.
I'm really selling it for you.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Honestly, really, if you want to be beat to death, then go and do it. But like,
okay.
You know, I think that it's kind of
being
fun.
beat to death is like an experience side. Yeah.
You know, I think that like it was fun for like the kids, you know, in the theater, but for me at a certain point, I was like halfway in, I was like, I just really want to watch Raiders, man.
Yeah.
There were times when I would like scan the audience to see if there were like any non-motion seats that we could just scoot to and like just watch the movie.
But other than that, you know, we've been watching. We've watched like 2 episodes of Reacher now, which is pretty good. I still really enjoy the movie, but I think the show, you know, has its own sort of simple TV pulp enjoyment. You know, it's a big tough, you know, big bad of a hero who beats ass at least once an episode.
It makes it look like it's nothing.
Yeah, and I think that I think that it has a lot of fun with that. We've been watching Peacemaker. We haven't seen the new episode yet that just came out. And then I've been going through and I've been working on an essay and potentially multiple essays on Halloween and the Halloween franchise. And so I've been independently, while she's been at work and stuff, whenever I have the chance, sitting down and watching one of the Halloween films, usually around like 7 a.m. I'm sitting down and watching a Halloween film. And so
yeah,
I've
nothing
made
like
it
watching
all...
a horror movie in broad daylight. You know, that's
yeah, you know,
yeah, very
Cup of coffee in hand. All right, let's do it.
yeah. Great movie. The first one's still the best. So.
Oh yeah, the first one is impeccable. I just finished 4 a few days ago. I think 4 is fine. It inherits so many problems from 2, but I think it does a better job at making just a more cohesive sort of experience than I think 2 does. 3 is fantastic. I love Season of the Witch.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's pretty much all that we've been watching. So kind of a mixed bag. Zach, you were at Gold Derby. You're now currently working on getting funding together for a movie. You don't have to tell us about it if you don't want to. That's entirely up to you.
I'll save it for if it ever happens. So
okay.
There you go.
When it happens, yeah.
Yes, when.
Yeah.
But how can people, if they would like to keep track of your journey, you know, what are the socials that they should follow you on, that kind of thing?
Oh, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Letterboxd at Zach Laws. That's ZACHLAWS. That's where I talk about movies and stuff. So.
Perfect. Is there any way that anyone can see any of your old work? Can they go to Gold Derby and find any of your old writing?
You can go to Gold Derby. My work's also been published on Looper. I do sort of movie articles there too from time to time. You can find my films on Vimeo.
Nice.
Or at least like whatever films I've uploaded so far, because I'm among other things a little lazy when it comes to uploading and updating. So
no, I totally get that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk with you. Thanks for giving us so much of your time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to tell our listeners before we sign off?
Oh, just I would say that an interesting, if you want to know more about In the Heat of the Night and that Oscar year in particular, you should read Mark Harris's book Pictures at a Revolution, which is where I got a lot of the information about that from. It's a really great read. It's all about the 5 films that were nominated for Best Picture in 1967, which were Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, In the Heat of the Night, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and Dr. Dolittle, and what those 5 films say about the transition from old Hollywood to new. So I'd say anybody who's more interested in that, in the kind of context with which we were talking about these films, they should check that book out. And also check out his other books, Five Came Back, which is all about the filmmakers who went off to serve in World War II, and also his new Mike Nichols biography. So I'm doing a lot of work selling Mark Harris's books for you.
Well, hopefully he'll appreciate it.
I hope so.
No, that was a great little bit. I'll have to check that out for sure. Thanks as always, everyone, for listening. If you want, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I also have a page or Letterboxd that you can go and see some of my reviews. Especially, I've been re-reviewing like all of the Halloween films. So yeah, you can also email us at thefilmbudspodcast at gmail.com. Questions, comments, concerns, cries for help, what have you. We're open for anything. And if you would like, it would mean a lot. And I think I mentioned it last week as well. We're trying to get Rotten Tomatoes certified. And one of the requirements is 200 reviews on Apple Podcasts that are above a 4.0. So we're at 130 right now, and if you haven't already, it would mean a lot to us if you could go and drop a review, because some people are like, why does getting certified matter? Essentially, it opens up certain doors, certain access points, and it can help the show grow, and it can help get us earlier access to certain pieces of content, and then we won't have to, bore you all to tears with all of our history lesson stuff as we nerd out over movies made 50 years ago.
Well, honestly, it's a part of the charm. If you've stuck here long enough at this point, you're used to the history.
No, that's true. But that's all that we have for y'all. Thanks as always for listening, and we'll catch you guys next week. Bye.